And then Dante and performance has also been a recent interest, and he's had numbers of people from different performance backgrounds, dance, video installations, things like that, just thinking about ways in which Dante can be extended. And today Robert's going to talk about Dante and Shakespeare and some issues of performance. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Robin Kirkpatrick.
What relationship is there, or should there be, between the academic study of literature and the practice of writing? One peaceable answer might be that we all need to know how to write, and by way of demonstration, the literary scholar might then go on proudly to point to all those big city lawyers who have learned their trade by reading the novels of Dickens. Well, some of my best friends are lawyers. But I'm not sure the response of this sort takes account of what writing really involves, or of how a fuller account might animate or galvanize our academic studies. And while I probably shan't get round to a better response than one I've already given today, I'm pretty sure that literary study, unless it keeps in touch with writing in its most experimental and sometimes dangerous forms, is likely to wither on the vine. So the account of writing that I want briefly to try out here before reading the passages on the handout will throughout emphasize, or probably overemphasize, the factors of risk that writing, and the writing of poetry in particular, will often involve. And this is why I've included the terms performance and translation in my title. Well, actually, the real reason was because David told me to include those. But in a word, the kind of writing that I'm interested in could easily be defined in terms, both of performance and translation. So poetry, in one of its many aspects, is concerned not only with the conceptual algebra that prose and argumentation and footnotes can display, but also with the scratch of the pen, the click and flicker of a busy computer, and above all, with the vibrations of lip and larynx, those psychosomatic reactions that often accompany the writing even of a thank you letter, and sometimes, as a rhythm, begins to form in the thorax and burst out in full-throated sympathy. Writing in that sense is a performance, and silent reading, perhaps, is a much overrated invention. Nor on this account can poetry always be defined as an act of communion with one's own sensitive soul. It is more of an act of communion with one's diaphragm, and if that is the case, then poetry promises a wider communion still. Drawing breath from the common air, poetry, in diaphragmatic performance, returns to that air. It enters a public space, acknowledging as it does that every word we speak has come from somewhere beyond us and now goes back to that beyond. All of which involves a risk and exposure of the kind that lawyers, and other professionals too, are usually employed to guard us against. In translation, the risk is in some ways even more acute. For logically speaking, translation is an impossibility. I gather that there's a conference running here at the moment on that very question. As Borges's Pierre Menard discovered, even an exact transcription of a text, which would of course not really count as a translation at all, would be received in an altered context as an act of interpretation. Exact translation is a contradiction in terms. Worse still, the original text lowers over the translator, suggesting that after all, there may be a last judgment or ultimate edition in which Dante spends eternity pointing out the infinite mistakes that one has perpetrated. Well, that may sound like paranoia, but paranoia can be fun, and one does it all the same, writes all the same, for the love of it, gratuitously, for the pleasure of performing, so to speak, the original score, as a violinist might perform a Beethoven concerto, regardless of any Beethovenian frown. Translators do all they can to get the words right, but right and wrong may not, after all, be the be-all and end-all, especially in the realm of literary language. In common with performance, translation can perhaps best be seen as a kind of homage, a gratuitous offering, beyond right or wrong, just there to encounter whatever is out there. So, in associating poetry with performance and translation, I want to draw attention to the way in which writing can poise itself, deliberately, gratuitously, on the verge or threshold of an interesting vacancy. Writing requires, or even desires, a response, and it may not get it. But then again, and exhilaratingly, it may. And breathing, breathless, it is worth the risk. This is to suggest, negatively, that poetry need not be, as sometimes it is thought to be, a sort of bungee jump back into the security of the poet's oh-so-sensitive ego. In positive terms, it is an acknowledgement of dependency, or rather a claim on interdependency, and an affirmation that the unknown is alive with engaging voices. Well, today I'm more concerned rather to try this out in performance than to excogitate a theory or manifesto. So give me 10 minutes or so, and I'll be reading from the passages on the handout. Here you'll find from page 2 onwards some poems of my own. These things of darkness I acknowledge mine, as Prospero might say. And here as well, to supervise these stumblings and flickerings, you'll find the names of Dante and Shakespeare. These two may prove either to be kindly guides or furious inquisitors, and I don't know which. It's likely, of course, that Shakespeare will emerge as the more sympathetic. Writing in his plays is by definition intended for performance on the dangerous stage. And surely it doesn't make much sense to speak of a Shakespearean book, unless by that one means a prompt copy, tattered and daily thumbed. Dante, on the other hand, sublimely egotistical, is often thought to have the book of the universe propped open as he proceeds. Doesn't he, after all, say as much in the last canto of the Paradiso? And isn't there some circle of hell, or at any rate Purgatorio, which is reserved for bad poets? Well, yes, there is, and yes, the authoritarian Dante is a favourite of Dante's scholars. But there is also a Dante, exemplified all too briefly on the handout, who depends upon response and submits himself to the impact of a smile, whether of welcome or derision, or a subtle blend of both. The Commedia is a comedy in concerning itself not only with authoritative answers, but also with a question that reveals the relativity or gratuitousness of any single utterance.